Hey there, 8th grade. Miss Boyd here, and I'm going to go through chapters 1 through 4 in To Kill a Mockingbird. So, it starts off with, when he was nearly 13, my brother Jim got his arm badly broken, okay? So, what'll be important at the beginning of this book is to note that it starts off talking about Jim being almost 13, and then it's going to have a flashback. It's going to jump back in time. So this whole book is basically jumping back and telling you how Jim got his arm badly broken. Okay? So it says the years had gone by, and basically Jim and Scout, your narrator, are arguing about it. So Scout, it says, is 4 years younger than her brother. So first, they talk about how the whole thing started. So they go back and tell you basically how the Finches came to America. So Simon Finch came from England because of religious persecution. And it says he was a fur trapping apothecary. So trapped animals sold their fur, apothecary, think medicine. Okay. And he eventually makes his way to Alabama. And it says, Simon, having forgotten his teacher's dictum, it talks about his religious teacher, on possession of human chattels, bought 3 slaves and established Finch's Landing. Okay, so he gets over to America. He makes a whole lot of money practicing medicine. Starts forgetting his religious teachings. He puts on a lot of things so people know he has money, and when he gets money, he buys slaves and he creates Finch's Landing, which is still in their family. So it says the male would always take over Finch's Landing until the generation of Scout's father. Okay, this is the first generation where the male did not take over Finch's Landing. So Atticus is the older brother. He becomes a lawyer. And you've got their sister, Alexander Finch. And then you have the younger brother, Jack Finch. Okay. And it goes through and talks about how Atticus basically put Uncle Jack, or his real name is John Hale Finch, basically worked and paid his brother's way through medical school. So you also find out that Uncle Jack is a doctor. Okay. And then in your book, you see a space. Okay. There's unlike your other paragraphs, there's a normal space in there. And so in this space, the reason it's there is because this is where your flashback starts. Okay. So it's where it starts. Macomb was an old town, but it was a tired old town when I first knew it. So think small town, Macomb, okay, in Alabama. And it's extremely hot there. It says everything moves slow, like at a snail's pace. And it says the country had just been told, or Macomb County had recently been told, that it had nothing to fear but fear itself. So we're looking at a small southern town after the Great Depression. And if you know anything about the Great Depression and the New Deal and all of that, the people that were hit the hardest are farmers. And this is a tiny southern town with a lot of farmers. Okay, so you're going to have a town where you're going to have, and in this book, you're going to have distinct social classes depending on their occupation. Okay, so you learn about Scout's family, her father Atticus, you got Jim, and then it says plus Calpurnia, our cook. Now, if you've read, you can tell Calpurnia is way more than a cook. But remember, Scout's telling you the story. So, Calpurnia, she describes her as angles and bones, nearsighted, squinty, and has a huge hand that is hard. So you know that hand is kind of, if you've ever had that in the back of the car by your parent or whatever. Calpurnia does that when Scout's out of line, or when the kids are out of line. So immediately, you as a reader should think 1930s, small southern town, African American cook in a white family, and she's more than their cook, that's allowed to discipline the children. Immediately, your mind should say, there's something different about this family than what the norm would be in the 1930s in a southern town. Okay. So it talks about the reason, like and I'll say this for Scout and Jim, a big important theme are mother figures for them. And Calpurnia is your first example. Okay. And as you read, I want you to look for 3 different ones. Okay. They have 3 different motherly figures, and Calpurnia is one. And they all represent different parts of a mother. So you can see Calpurnia is there day in and day out. Yes, she cooks and she cleans, but she also disciplines them and teaches them right from wrong. So that's the side of the mother she represents, because it says their mother died when Scout was 2, so she doesn't really remember her much. But Jim was older, okay, and he was old enough to know her and to miss her. So it tells you this is how much time you know has passed. When I was almost 6 and Jim was nearly 10. So we've jumped back 3 years. Okay. And in the summertime, that's when Dill comes, or Charles Baker Harris. Okay. And they go over to their neighbor, which is Miss Rachel Haverford, and they see Dill sitting among the collard greens out in the garden. And he's tiny. So they ask him how old he is, and he's almost 7, so he's 6, and that means he's Scout's age. And the thing that Charles Baker Harris loves to do is reading, and anything you need reading, I can do it for you. And the reason he says it like that is because, yes, he can read, but it's also almost like the used car salesman. Like, anything you need, I can do it for you. I'll do it. And he is like that. And you'll notice this as you read with Dill. You have to try to figure out if his stories are true or not, because he tells a lot of them. So it describes Dill as a curiosity with shorts that button into his shirt. He's tow-headed, he's got white hair, and he's older than Scout, but Scout's way bigger than he is, and he has a cowlick that he picks up there. So it says when Dill retells the tale of Dracula, and if you've ever picked up the book of Dracula, like, it's huge, okay? When he tells that tale, Jim's like, all right, this kid's not so bad. He can hang out with us. And by the end of the summer, okay, because Dill comes and visits with his Aunt Rachel in the summer, they talk about making Boo Radley come out. So the Radley, again, this is Scout telling you the story, so you're going to have to figure out what's really true about them and what's not. And as you read, sorry, I got to adjust. I'm in a rocking chair. You're going to figure that out. So the town describes him as a phantom, and that terrorizes the town, kills chickens. Everything that comes from their yard is poisonous. And it goes back there and gives you a little bit of history. So the Radleys were different from everyone in a small town. So think small town, everybody goes to church, doors are open on Sunday, hanging out on the porch, everybody's welcome. They didn't go to church. They didn't hang out with everyone. So immediately that set them apart from everybody else, which means they're talked about all of the time. And it says, according to neighborhood legend, so again, you have to figure out if this is true or not. When Arthur Radley, who is Boo Radley, was a child, he got in some trouble, got mixed up with the wrong kids. They were drinking and things like that. And basically, when he got in trouble for that and arrested, Mr. Radley promised that Arthur would never, ever, ever cause anyone trouble again. And so the judge released Arthur back into his father's care, and then nobody saw him or heard from him again in 15 years. So think about why that might be. You'll find out more as we read. So eventually, Miss Stephanie Crawford said one day, and Miss Stephanie Crawford is the town gossip. So, I mean, let's be real. Should you listen to what she says has to say? Probably not all the time. Not necessarily always true. That Miss Radley ran out of her house screaming because Boo, who was 33 years old, then stabbed his Mr. Radley. I'll use his name, Mr. Radley's leg with his scissors, and then just kept on clipping like he didn't do anything wrong. So take that or leave it right now. Just keep it in the back of your mind. You're going to have to figure out what's true and what's not. And so at this point, Boo's locked up inside. They try to lock him in the basement of the courthouse, but it's too damp down there and he'll get sick. So again, he's locked inside the house. And it says, but Jim figured that Mr. Radley kept him chained to the bed most of the time. So it says Mrs. Radley, they don't see him as a ton, or her a ton, and Mr. Radley they would see every now and then walking to and from town. He never really said anything to anyone. And then they had the older son that moved to Pensacola. So there was a time when Mr. Radley ends up dying, and because of that, the older son moves home to take care of the house. Okay? And the older son is Mr. Nathan Radley. And they would see him walk to and from town, and they say he bought cotton, which basically just means they don't really know if he does anything, but he still makes money. They don't know what he does, though. But he would at least say hello, so he's a little nicer. Okay? And Jim gives his description of Boo, that he was 6.5 feet tall, and he dined on raw squirrels and cats, and his hands were always blood-stained, and he... And he had this jagged scar across his face, and his teeth were rotten and yellow, and he drooled, and his eyes were bug-eyed. Okay, let's be real here. You think that's true? So, they had this idea, or Dill did, to try to make Boo Radley come out, because, of course, when you describe somebody like that, like, I want to see who this man is. And so, they make this bet at the end of chapter 1, whether Jim will go up and touch the house, and of course you can tell Jim doesn't want to do it, but so he's not called a chicken. He eventually does, and it says the old house was still the same after they look back from when Dill came up and tagged it and came back. But as we stared down the street, we thought we saw an inside shutter flick, a tiny, almost invisible movement, and the house was still. So somebody or something was in there while they were outside watching. Okay. So, chapter 2, school starts. Scout's excited, except Jim is like, little sister, we can play at home, but we cannot hang out at school. Okay? So, we have Miss Caroline Fisher, who's not from there, and she's fresh from school, and she's got the best new way of teaching. Okay? And that's a problem because Scout already knows way more than everyone else, which for Miss Caroline and her new method doesn't work. Okay, so she tells her that Atticus has to stop teaching her to read, and Scout doesn't understand. My dad didn't teach me. All she's done is sat in her father's lap as she's grown up, and her father's just read out loud, done with the letters, and eventually, the more she sees, the more she hears, she just learned to read because her father read to her. So, at break, Scout's frustrated. Jim tries to calm her down. And when they go back in, Scout is writing, not printing. She's writing in cursive. Okay? So remember, she's 6. And the teacher says, you're not allowed to do that because you're not allowed to know that yet. And she blames Calpurnia on this because Calpurnia would have her write in cursive scripture when she would get in trouble. So that also tells you something about Calpurnia, because having an older, she is older, African-American woman in the 1930s know how to read and write is a big deal. Calpurnia is different, okay? So it's lunchtime. Some kids bring their lunch, some like Scout go home for lunch, and you meet Walter Cunningham. So you're going to notice as you read through this book, it refers to people by their last names, the Cunninghams, the Ewells, the this, the Finches, etc. So it's almost as if whatever your last name is, that's your family history, that's what you're tied to, that's what your stereotype is. So in here you have Walter Cunningham. He doesn't have a lunch. And it says he had hookworms constantly because he was barefoot all of the time. And it says he did have on a clean shirt and neatly mended overalls, but most of the time he didn't have that. So she tries to be helpful, Miss Caroline does, to give him some money, but he doesn't take it. So Scout tries to explain why. That the Cunninghams never take something they can't pay back. They're farmers. They have no money after the Great Depression. And so they're poor, but they only take what they can pay back. They're honest. That's important, okay? Because it even says Atticus had to help. His name is also Walter Cunningham Sr., basically with keeping his land and things like that. He couldn't pay Atticus, but he brought him crops, okay, or bags of nuts and things off their land. So they're hardworking, they're honest, they're very poor, but they never take something they are sure they cannot pay back. In 25 cents, the Cunninghams cannot pay back, okay? So she tries to explain that to the teacher, and Miss Caroline gives her a whipping with the ruler, the ting, 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 and then the whole class laughs because they realize it was a whipping. And then they're all dismissed for lunch. And Miss Caroline hasn't had a very good half of her first day. So chapter 3 starts with Scout. And here's where you can tell the tomboy. Remember what I told you about your author. She's out there beating Walter Cunningham up for getting her in trouble, and Jim has to pull him off. So Jim invites Walter home for dinner, which really means lunch. It's lunchtime, okay? And he promises Scout won't bother him anymore. So they get home, and you'll notice at lunch, Walter doesn't talk to the kids. He talks to Atticus about farming like he's a grown man. So because of the trials that his family has experienced, he's had to work, unlike Scout and Jim. And so he knows a lot more because of the poverty his family has faced. And then you have him, this is something my dad would do, mix all his food together and he pours the syrup all over it. My dad does hot sauce. And Scout, I mean, she doesn't always have a filter, makes fun of how he's eating. And you notice who disciplines. It's not Atticus. Atticus stays with the company, and Calpurnia pulls her in the kitchen and lets her have it. And she tells her that she can't be rude. And when she responds, he ain't company, Cal, he's just a Cunningham, she immediately looks at her and she says, you are no better than anyone else, Cunningham or not. We're all the same. So don't ever treat anybody like that. And then, of course, she gets a little spanking. She has to eat by herself. So we are back at school, second half of the day. And I love little Chuck Little. He's not a very important character, but he's quite chivalrous. And you have Miss Caroline scream because there's a cootie on Burris Ewell. And little Chuck Little will take care of it. Anything. I will help you. And you find out the cootie is on Burris Ewell. Okay? And Burris Ewell, it says, was the filthiest human being I had ever seen. His neck was dark gray, his hands were rusty, his fingernails were black, and the only clean spot he has is right here. And so, did we figure out what the cootie was? Anybody? Anybody? It's lice. So, Burris has lice. And so, of course, he's got to be sent home. And you have this discussion, and it's not a nice one, between Burris and Miss Caroline, okay? And Burris basically is going to leave, and you find out he only comes the first day and he never comes back. And Miss Caroline, knowing the rules of truancy, knows it's wrong. It's that he's supposed to come back and that she's supposed to report him. And you see Burris Ewell say some extremely unkind things to Miss Caroline. So think about it. This is the day and age where kids don't have computers, videos, or anything to look and pick up language or anything like that. So if you are a kid and you're living in this time period, where you get your language from it's from the people you're around, especially your family. So immediately, although you haven't met the entire Ewell family and you didn't even see Burris Ewell that long, you can tell that this family, there's something about them. Not only are they filthy physically, but the words and the things that they say and how they treat others, it's not right either. Okay? So much so that little Chuck Will is going to stand in and protect Miss Caroline. So Burr's evil leaves. Okay? So they go home. Scout's not had a really wonderful day because, and we find out as she talks to Atticus, she doesn't want to go back to school. And it all boils down to she doesn't like Miss Caroline. And Atticus says to her, "You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it." And he's trying to get his daughter to see that Miss Caroline is new and she knows absolutely nothing about Macomb County, and all the kids in Scout, they're assuming that she does. And Miss Caroline is also trying to learn too. And so he's trying to beg her some patience, and she's got to go back to school. And so they kind of make a deal, because really it just boils down to Scout wants to still read with her father. So he makes a deal that if she'll go to school, he'll read with her and they won't tell. And then at the end of this chapter, it talks about the Ewells, and that it talks about them not coming back to school, and that the Ewells are an exception to a lot of laws that they have in Macomb County. And you find out in there that they bend the law for them, such as that they're allowed to, the Ewell family is allowed to trap and hunt out of season. And you find out that the reason for that is because Mr. Ewell, who doesn't have a job, gets checks, basically unemployment checks from the government, okay? But instead of using it to help his children and help feed his children, he buys alcohol with it and he drinks it. So basically, this is telling you more about the Ewell family. They're very poor. They don't have money, but they're not honest with what they have. And so the father, who's supposed to take care of his children, doesn't, and he uses that money for himself. So the Ewells are allowed to trap and hunt out of season because otherwise those children would starve. That should tell you something about that family. Okay? So, chapter 4. The gifts. Okay? Out of a tree that's on the edge of the Radley property, they find, well, Scout finds first the gum. And then they find the Indian head pennies. Okay? So, these things, they're not sure where they're coming from, but they're great gifts and they're keeping them. I mean, Indian head pennies during this time period, and they were nicely taken care of. That was something somebody treasured. And Jim can kind of tell that. And so Jim is kind of wondering where these are coming from. He's thinking along those lines. Scout's just like, "Ooh, exciting, I get a gift." And Jim is like, "These are really nice." Like, and gum, unlike today, is a real treat, especially Wrigley's gum, okay? So who would be willing to give us something that they hold dear to them? Who is it and why are they doing it? That will appear again. And then we have Dill appear. He's back, okay? And they're talking about different superstitions like hot steams and ghosts. And let me reiterate that Dill comes and visits his aunt during the summer, okay? So we have we have a couple of things dealing with the Radleys in this chapter. The first one is they get in a tire. I don't know if any of y'all ever done this. So they get in the tire and they want to push them down the street, down the hill to ride down in it, like zoom, zoom, zoom. And so Scout gets in it. She goes all the way down the hill and then lands in the Radley yard. And she's so dizzy. And of course, Jim and Dill are like, "Get out, get out, get out." And at this point, Alpernia is on the porch. They go in and they get some lemonade and stuff like that. And after they go back out, Dill decides, Dill and Jim basically, it's Jim's idea. they decide to play the Radley game. And Scout's like, I don't know. Atticus kind of doesn't want us to, but they do it anyways. Okay? And they all play their different parts. Mrs. Radley, Mr. Radley, the scissors, all of those things. And as far as the scene with the scissors, they acted out in around the corner. Here comes Atticus. Okay? And they kind of get busted. And Atticus looks at them and he said it multiple times. Leave them be. Leave Boo Radley alone. Leave the Radleys alone. Okay? And then at the very end, it has this paragraph. It's kind of done this. This is the second time. Atticus's arrival was the second reason I wanted to quit the game. The first reason happened the day I rolled into the Radley front yard. Through all the head shaking, quelling of nausea, and Jim yelling, I had heard another sound, so low I could not have heard it from the sidewalk. Someone inside the house was laughing. So twice now when the kids are outside playing, just being silly, it's referenced that somebody inside the Radley house is watching and laughing. I mean, you'd probably laugh too if you saw somebody roll down a hill in a tire and fall out and not be able to walk straight. So it's kind of presented that twice to you. Okay? So chapter 5 through 8 is next. And then just let me say this about the chapters. I already kind of talked about motherly figures for the Finch kids. You are going to get another look at another motherly figure. So be looking for that in the next 4 chapters. See you later.